The agenda is going to have to rebuild the world economy because the global threats of pandemic, of climate change, of technological slowdown, these are all things that are global in effect and need global approaches, not in some soft-hearted, namby-pamby, oh, we must all cooperate, but in very practical terms, the policies among the major economies have to be aligned, and you have to take care of the spillover effects. The lack of trust and the going the separate ways, we've seen the disasters it's fed for public health and for growth and recovery right now. So looking ahead, how much are we getting out of this? You mentioned the stalled fiscal package in the US, and I think the odds of there being a package before January now are exceedingly low. There's very little interest in the Republican majority in the Senate in passing such a package. It is conceivable after the election, if there were a Democratic majority to be coming into the Senate, in January, that then the Republican majority that still exists would want to have their fingers on the package, their fingerprints on it, some control, but it's not very likely. How much does this matter? In human terms, of course, it matters a great deal, but in terms of the economic outlook, the economy can limp along okay into January. The US economy's main vulnerabilities right now are the remaining still very large number of unemployed people, but a lot of them had built up income and savings in recent months. And so it's not ideal, but they are managing to survive. The state and local governments in the US are very sharply deprived of money because their tax revenues are down and they're required to balance their budgets. And they have direct impact on human services, on spending, on police and medical and education. And so the biggest agenda item, frankly, for the fiscal package in the US should be relieving the tension for the state and local governments. And that would also have, in Keynesian terms, the biggest multiplier because it would be immediately spent on things people care about. Looking a little further out, what's going to happen? Well, what we've seen in both in Western Europe and the US is a couple things that I'm sure your audience here is well aware of, but let me restate. First, the lockdowns actually don't matter that much. What matters is people's perception of how much they are at risk to get the virus. And so what matters is, can you get the public health under control? And Italy, frankly, has done a commendable job compared to the US, UK, and many others after the initial tragedies in in the Milan area. The second point, which is obvious but has to be made, is that monetary policy is probably at the limit of what it can do in terms of fomenting a recovery. Monetary policy, I would argue, is asymmetric, meaning it's good at defense but not offense, if you want to put it in football terms. You can defend against a goal. You can keep the economy from collapsing and breaking down if there's a financial panic, if there's a currency problem, if there's a deflationary shock, but you can't score the goal. You cannot force people to spend, force investors to invest by making policy moves. And that's where we are right now, both in the Euro area and in the US. So it is about fiscal policy and about private recovery. And then the third point is we're now already into the tricky part, which is not just the initial shock, but having to assess both private markets and policymakers how many of these distressed sectors, like in-person retail, like tourism and hospitality, like various forms of public transport, office buildings, how many of those sectors will come back to quote unquote normal or pre-pandemic levels versus how many of those sectors permanently will have to shrink and people and capital have to move elsewhere. And that's very difficult to call. And you always have the trade-off. It's similar to dealing with natural disasters in Italy or floods in New Orleans in the US. You want to rebuild, but if you rebuild in a place that's untenable, you may just be encouraging people to put themselves in harm's way. And so this debate about what's the right way of doing stimulus so that you're not perpetuating jobs that can't really be supported anymore, that is the difficult part. The Biden economic program is well thought out. It is, if implemented as stated, significantly further left than any program we've had from a US president for decades. But it still remains not left by European terms, only left by American terms. The key issue, which Charlie Cook made reference to, and I will reiterate, is whether you get a Democratic majority in the Senate. There is an enormous amount, and Marta and others from Aspen Italia have heard me say this for several years now, and we've warned people about this with Trump. There is an enormous amount on trade, on regulation, on environment, on enforcement of labor laws that the president can do by diktat, by executive order. But anything to do with budget and taxes has to go through the Senate. And a lot of the things that Biden wants to do, like empowering unions, raising the minimum wage, he cannot do without a Senate majority, and a significant Senate majority, because the senators who will come in as Democrats, if there are elected new senators, will tend to be more moderate than the previous senators because they'll be winning in